David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's really important for me not to be hyperbolic in this segment because this is so serious, but to accurately communicate to you the dire situation that we're in with regard to the 2020 election, the language might sound like what is normally hyperbolic language, but in this case, it just accurately reflects the circumstances. What I'm talking about is that the 2020 election is not going to be a fair election in what most of us imagine when we say a fair election. If a Democrat is to defeat Donald Trump in 2020, it's going to be despite all sorts of underhanded tactics and endless betrayals of the type of election that our founding fathers wanted us to have year in and year out. Foreign interference happened in 2016. Trump just said to George Stephanopoulos on national TV that he'd welcome help again in 2020. Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, are simply blocking any bill to secure the election from foreign interference, which we've talked about. The big voting machine lobbyists are now donating to Mitch McConnell's campaign, which we've talked about. Voter suppression, not voter fraud. Remember, voter suppression, which is this package of policies that Republicans have been pushing for decades to limit voting hours, to limit voting locations in poorer, non-white, Democratic-leaning areas, combined with using the boogeyman of voter fraud as a sort of straw man to justify voter purges and voter ID laws and so much more. Gerrymandering, which already favors Republicans because of the urban-rural divide just systemically, but is used even more grossly to favor Republicans in how the congressional districts are currently drawn. The very real possibility that Donald Trump, if at any point he truly starts to believe that he is losing, rather than writing off all the polls as fake, panics and tries to get us into a military conflict. It could be Iran, could be Venezuela, could be, almost anything with this guy. That does affect voters, and it will be another thing that Democrats and whoever is the eventual Democratic nominee is going to need to overcome. So what I want to convey to you today is that even if we deal with any three of these four major ways in which this is not going to be a fair election, it is going to be an uphill battle where the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she ultimately is going to need to overcome significant slanting in the infrastructure of this election in order to actually win. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible, but what you need to do is immediately put out of your mind the idea that it might be a fair election, because it's just not going to be, okay? There's a Rolling Stone article pointing out that Republicans are more than willing to help make this an unfair election. So if you are even considering, like for a split second, not voting because of all of these things, you should rethink that, okay? If you say the election is fundamentally slanted towards Donald Trump's reelection, so I'm not going to vote, that is the exact wrong reaction to be having. You need to vote because your vote is so much more important, given that this is going to require, if the Democratic candidate is going to win, going above and beyond all of these systemic factors that have the playing field slanted in the direction of Donald Trump. The last midterm, okay, the 2018 midterms, that also was not a fair election. Democrats were able to pick up record seats in the House because people voted in such numbers that we were stronger than the lack of fairness that is implicit in the system in a way that tilts towards Republicans in the ways that I described. So you need to realize that we're fighting people who don't care about fairness, okay? The Republican Party decided decades ago that they don't care about being fair or behaving appropriately or running elections in a way that is in line with what the founding fathers wanted. This is basically sport to them, okay? It's just wins and losses. That's all it is. It's strikes and balls or whatever. All that matters is wins on the board. If the policies destroy farmers in the Midwest, if they destroy democracy at its core, whatever, if they destroy the middle class, as long as this Republican Party sees that they are, quote, winning and checking off the right boxes on the scoreboard, that is all that they care about. So on the one hand, We can't stoop to their level because we are not like them. But if we don't start winning somehow, we will never take them out of power. And that's what the left needs to understand. And that's why a lot of my focus lately has been on trying to unite the left rather than allowing these arbitrary and rigid divisions of the left to fracture the left, because we're up against significant unfairness in this upcoming election. So if you don't vote, we don't even have a chance. Even if you do, we still need to overcome all the injustice of the system that they've successfully put in place over the last several decades for their own gain, at their own, for their own advantage. So that should, I hope, motivate you to vote rather than say, I'm not even going to bother. If you disagree with my take on this, I want to hear from you. If you think that this scenario means you shouldn't even bother voting, I vehemently disagree with you. And I hope you'll call in later this week when I take live calls and confront me about it, because it's something I absolutely want to talk to you about, because it is so important. It is, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but the reality is extreme, and we need to understand that. Okay, it's time for really obvious stuff that in the Trump era, we actually have to say out loud, because a lot of people don't seem to understand it, or they've fallen for talking points and have been confused about what the reality is. The foreign help that Trump said last week in an interview with George Stephanopoulos he would welcome from other countries is illegal, okay? Last week, to remind you, Donald Trump was interviewed on ABC News by George Stephanopoulos, and he was asked, what would you do, President Trump, if in 2020, once again, Russia or China or whoever comes to you with dirt on your eventual Democratic opponent? And Donald Trump said that he would accept the information because, of course, nothing says I didn't collude in 2016 like saying I'd be willing to collude in 2020. Let me remind you of what Donald Trump said, just so we all are familiar with the clip I'm referring to.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do?
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever
Al
you do.
Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it. If I thought there was something wrong, I'd go maybe to the FBI if I thought there was something wrong. But when somebody comes up with Oppo research, right? They come up with Oppo research. Oh, let's call the FBI. The FBI doesn't have enough agents to take care of it. But you go and talk honestly to congressmen. They all do it. They always have. And that's the way it is. It's called Oppo research.
Okay, so all of that foreign Oppo research that Trump is referring to is illegal to accept as an American presidential candidate. There's a very good piece in the LA Times which outlines a variety of different views on this. And what's important to understand is that it is, quote, unlawful for a foreign national directly or indirectly, keywords, directly or indirectly, to make a contribution or donation of money or other thing of value, important, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election. It is also illegal for a campaign to, quote, solicit, accept, or receive anything of value from a foreigner. So it's two-sided. It's illegal for the foreigners to do it. Whether you can actually hold them accountable if they're not in the United States is a question mark. It seems to be no. And it's equally illegal for the recipient in the United States to do the receiving. Trump said he would accept it and receive it. It is therefore something that would be against the law. Ellen Weintraub chairs the FEC. She put out a statement saying, quote, let me make something 100% clear to the American public and anyone running for public office. It is illegal for any person to solicit, accept, or receive anything of value from a foreign national in connection with a U.S. election. Now, let's be thorough. There are some lawyers who are disputing that dirt on opponents is a specifically quantifiable thing of value, meaning it might not be illegal in this way. The idea is dirt on an opponent, which helps you win, is worth what? If you can't put a specific dollar value on it, it's not quantifiably a thing of value, and therefore it might sort of skirt around the illegality that Ellen Weintraub says exists. So you might say, well, if I get dirt from my opponent and it helps me win, and my salary is $175,000 a year, was the dirt worth $175,000? Well, it's not quite so cut and dry. But what this ignores is that it's worth something. And this is why lots of legal experts say, even if we can't say exactly what the value is of that dirt on opponents, it has value. And in addition to that, the foreign country has presumably spent some amount of money and resources in gathering that dirt on your opponents, which gives it more specific value. If it cost a foreign national $50,000 to gather this dirt on your opponent, then we can much more easily say, well, it's worth $50,000 because that's what it cost the foreign national. That's what it cost the foreign national to obtain that information. So I think it is one of the weakest defenses I've heard that it's not really illegal because we can't specifically quantify the value of the dirt. It has value. It costs money to obtain the dirt. And by the way, Donald Trump also said in that interview with George Stephanopoulos that everyone is doing this. That's not true. I mean, sure, it's probably true that someone is doing it. But unless Donald Trump can start citing specific examples of where American candidates and elected officials accepted things of value in this way from foreign powers, it's on him to tell us that everybody is doing it and to prove that everybody is doing it. And think how far we've come from the beginning to this interview with George Stephanopoulos. There was nothing with any foreign country. There was something, but no Trump insiders had a clue. There was something, and some Trump insiders had a clue, but it wasn't illegal to, oh yeah, we do it all again in 2020, emboldened like the sort of little kids that they effectively are. Don't let them get away with this. Don't let them get away with this again in 2020. We can vote them out. Yes, the playing field is not level. It's stacked against us, as I said in the first segment in today's show. But if enough people vote, we can override that and we can actually get him out. And that's what we need to be doing because he's saying it on national television. He would do it all again. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let me thank two really great people today. Stephen Heller and David Howery are today's new David Pakman Show members of the day. Membership is the #1 funding source for our show. Membership comes with really great extra perks and member benefits, including the world-famous daily bonus show and lots of other great stuff. And most importantly, when you become a member, you are saying, I understand the importance of supporting media that I like. I understand the importance of supporting media that I don't want to be dependent on advertisers and that can just cover what they want to cover without any calculation needing to be made about how our advertisers going to feel about it. And that's why it's so important that great people like Stephen and David sign up and to stick with us for a while. And today's longtime sustaining member of the day is Jamel Craik. Jamel Craik has been a member since 2014, almost 5 years of membership, and I really appreciate it. Join all of them by signing up at www.joinpakman.com. In the latest news from the sort of hear no evil, see no evil camp, Donald Trump has fired the internal pollsters that I told you about last week, who did polls for Trump in really important battleground states and came back to him and said, hey, you're down in these states. In hypothetical matchups against Biden, Bernie, Warren, you're losing in these states. And the numbers were not super surprising because Trump's own internal polls found he was down to Biden in Michigan and Wisconsin. And his favorability has been negative in Michigan and Wisconsin for a while. In other words, the numbers Trump got from his pollsters were completely and totally consistent with what the public information has been for several months, which was that Trump is not doing well in these states. And if the election were held today, he would likely lose. Trump had internal polls from 17 different states, and the numbers were very concerning in many of them. And what Donald Trump has done, instead of saying, wow, I really need to get a campaign together, he has instead fired the pollsters, effectively saying, kill the messenger. Baisley and Associates have been fired. Adam Geller, who has been a pollster for Trump since 2016, has been fired. The polling company run by Brett Lloyd has been fired. And fascinatingly, it's being reported that Donald Trump fired them not only or specifically because Trump necessarily thinks the polls are wrong, but because Trump is also furious about the fact that the polls leaked, which is so funny because every public poll said the exact same thing. In other words, even without the internal polls leaking, every poll that is being done right now shows that Donald Trump is down in those key battleground states. So I don't believe for a second that being down isn't a factor. Trump obviously doesn't like polls that say that he's down. But even if he thinks the numbers are false, he seems genuinely angry with the pollsters that the information became public, which is just so silly because it's all public anyway. So the reaction we want to this is the same as what I said last week. We want Donald Trump to think he's winning, okay? If Donald Trump thinks he's winning, he'll campaign less. He'll take more for granted, and it will just make it more likely that Donald Trump will actually end up losing in 2020. And part of this is Donald Trump's fragile ego, which we've become very well acquainted with over the last couple of years. Part of this is Trump's narcissism, as Bill Eddy pointed out and told us about on yesterday's program, a licensed mental health professional. But the most important thing in the end is that Democrats benefit from a Trump that believes that he's ahead. We want Trump to campaign less, which he will do if he thinks he's winning. So even though it's hilarious that Donald Trump is so triggered by negative polls that he's firing pollsters and saying suppress the information, the less Trump campaigns, the better off the eventual Democratic nominee will be. Now, imagine working at the White House now. Trump wants just good news. So if you work at the White House, whether you're a pollster, a staffer, an aide, whatever, you are in the position where you either have to lie to Trump and give him only good fake news all the time, or you tell the truth and you risk losing your job and getting fired, as many people already have. It's sort of like working for one of those authoritarian dictators that have to be placated at all times, which is yet another similarity between Donald Trump and that group, which is a group not typically similar to or associated with the American president, but of course that has changed significantly under Donald Trump. And there's this really strange circle when it comes to the polling, because the regular sort of MAGA-ite Trumpist talking point is we can't trust the polls because in 2016, the polls said Hillary would win and Hillary lost. Of course, the truth is that the national polls in 2016 said Hillary would win the popular vote by 2 to 3 points and Hillary won the popular vote by 2 to 3 points. But it doesn't matter. The MAGA-ite talking point is the polls are fake. So now the polls say Trump is losing. And they see that as confirmation that the polls are biased because they were supposedly wrong in 2016, even though they weren't. And they don't even consider the possibility that Donald Trump could actually be losing. So the result is that the pollsters actually are the ones that get fired. Here's the end of the line. We want Donald Trump to believe that 2020 is in the bag. Every left-wing voter needs to not believe that the election is in the bag and that your vote could make the difference in whatever state you're voting in. I did a story earlier today between foreign interference and gerrymandering and voter suppression. We will only win this election if we overcome all of that stuff. We can control turnout, and enough turnout will override all of that other stuff, period. But you've got to get out there and vote. We want Trump to think he's winning. We want Trump to stay home. But in the end, every single voter needs to believe, because it could be the case, that their vote could make or break their state for Trump or whoever the eventual Democratic nominee will be. That's the way I voted in Massachusetts, and I'm still going to be operating under that assumption. Donald Trump is what in the world of poker or chess we call on tilt, because of the widespread reporting of these truly terrible polling numbers that have been released over the last 10 days or so. And I'll remind you once again, according to Donald Trump's own internal polling and public polls, as of right now, Donald Trump is losing badly in some key 2020 battleground states. He's fired some pollsters, just reported that to you in the last story. He's called the polls fake. He's done everything under the sun to try to suppress the news of those polls. But now he is even calling Fox News fake news. This is getting very, very interesting. Brett Baier on Fox News did something, which is not really a huge deal. Brett Baier just reported what the polls are saying, including this new Fox News poll that I told you about yesterday, which says Trump is down by 9 to Bernie and by 10 to Joe Biden in hypothetical 2020 matchups. And because Brett Baier merely said, we did a poll and here's what it says, Donald Trump immediately took to Twitter and attacked Brett Baier for spreading fake news, tweeting, quote, Fox News polls are always bad for me. That's not true, by the way. They were against crooked Hillary also. Something weird going on at Fox. Our polls show us leading in all 17 swing states. That's also a lie. For the record, I didn't spend 30 hours with ABC News, but rather a tiny fraction of that. More fake news, Brett Baier. So there are a couple of things going on here, and one of them is exactly as I predicted months ago, and this is something serious that we have to talk about so that we all understand it. Many of you, if you've been watching this program for a while or listening to the radio show or podcast, you know that sometimes on Fox News, Shepard Smith or Chris Wallace will say something moderately rational. They'll tell some basic uncontroversial truth. They'll counter some obvious bogus right-wing talking point. And it really shouldn't be a huge deal when someone on the news just tells the truth. But on Fox News, it sort of is a big deal because it is such a disinformation echo chamber. So when I talk about it on the show, I will say, it's good that Shepard Smith told the truth. It's good that Chris Wallace told the truth, but it's a very low bar. And we have to understand that it's very limited opposition to an overall narrative that is extraordinarily pro-Trump on Fox News. And the danger is that these little instances of sanity on Fox can also open the door for Fox to say, hey, look, we are fair and balanced. We have multiple views represented. We have almost everything. And then on the other hand, every once in a while, Shep Smith is allowed to say something that's true. Now, it's absurd since a reporter, Shep Smith, for example, stating a fact shouldn't be considered a balancing of the rampant right-wing xenophobic propaganda that Fox is riddled with, but it does sort of open the door for Fox to take some cover under the fact that they have Shep Smith and Chris Wallace. Now, along the same lines, when Donald Trump calls Brett Baier fake news, or at least Brett Baier's report fake news, that can similarly be used to prop Fox up as, hey, they're also getting slammed by Trump. Fox is no different. They are under the microscope by Trump, just like CNN and everybody else, instead of the real fact, the reality that the right-wing echo chamber propaganda network of Fox News is 99% propaganda. And as I said a few months ago, depending on how 2020 goes, Fox News could abandon Trump. Fox News is, of course, committed to being right-wing because that's what their donors and their funders demand and expect. They are right-wing. They will continue to be right-wing. But Fox News is not necessarily committed to Donald Trump. Fox, you might remember, back in 2016, really in 2015, when the campaign started, Fox was not behind Donald Trump early in the 2016 Republican primary. There were some big conflicts between Fox and Trump early on. Now, eventually, when it became clear that Donald Trump had growing support, that more and more of the Republican establishment was getting behind Donald Trump, even begrudgingly in some sense, Fox ultimately got behind Donald Trump. If Trump continues to be an utter and total embarrassment on the world stage, but it looks like he's going to win re-election in 2020, Fox will stay behind him. But if it looks like Trump will fail, as some early polls suggest he might, Fox News is not necessarily going to stick with Trump. They're about profit and right-wing propaganda in a general sense. Trump might be the vehicle for that propaganda, but he also might not. And just to prepare you, if Trump and Fox have a falling out, you need to know that Donald Trump's network of choice is going to become this absolutely whacked out thing called OAN, the One American News Network, or One American News. Check it out online, but not with kids in the room and not close to meal times, because it is truly, it'll turn your stomach. But OAN is where Trump will go if ultimately he abandons Fox News as the propaganda vehicle of choice. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pacman. And while you're there, follow the show on Instagram as well, at David Pakman Show. We will take a quick break. Boy, it's a good program today. Glad you're with me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Dr. Heidi Tworek, who's an assistant professor of international history at the University of British Columbia and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Great to talk to you today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit, maybe just to establish some of the terms we're going to be using. When we talk about public opinion and published opinion, and how we should be thinking about those two concepts and how they differ, what are we talking about? Published opinion and public opinion.
So this is one of the really basic distinctions that I make in the book that I've just published. Is so often political or economic elites think that what's published in a newspaper or today what's said on TV is public opinion, what everybody thinks. And what I would say instead is that's actually published opinion, which is what a certain set of journalists and other people have produced. Public opinion, by contrast, is sort of aggregate of all the things that people think in a population. And we have to be careful not to think that the American public has one public opinion. So part of what I talk about is how this often gets misunderstood, and leaders actually think that something is public opinion that is actually published opinion.
It seems that this is a distinction that goes back, I mean, I guess maybe to telegraphy, right? In the sense that there was a point at which you, as an individual existing in the world, were hearing about what people believed from those people. It really depended on the conversations that you were having with the so-called public. And at a certain point, it became possible to put some other sort of opinion in the hands of those who have access to the means of communication and communicate more quickly than an individual might be able to with someone else. Is that sort of the origins of when public and published opinion started to separate?
To a certain extent. I mean, newspapers as a genre, so printed forms of news, they begin much earlier, so really in the 16th century, but they don't become very dominant until the 19th century. So it's really with industrialization that we see the rise of the mass urban newspaper. And those are moments that are very tied to things like telegraphy, where you can send news across the Atlantic so much faster. And there are particular newspapers, or especially news agencies, firms that emerge that are basically just doing the job of collecting news from around the world and sending it through telegraphy for other newspapers to print. So a lot of what I've written about is the power of these news agencies. So some of them still exist today, like Reuters or the Associated Press, and they really emerge in the mid-19th century, about the same time as telegraphy, and they become really important bottlenecks of global news. There are very few newspapers that have foreign correspondents or anything else, but most of the people who are reading newspapers didn't really know what news agencies were. So you start to see sort of industrial division of labor, where just a few companies are really controlling the sorts of national and international news that the vast majority of people who are buying newspapers will read.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So I guess what I was not, in thinking of newspapers as predating telegraphy, the distribution of those newspapers was still happening much more slowly. It depended on someone bringing the newspaper, but you're absolutely right that does, of course, predate telegraphy. To go to the early 20th century and the use of some of these mass communication methods, published opinion, to use published opinion to influence public opinion. Maybe in Germany we could even talk about. What are some of the important sort of data points or milestones in the way that this was used to government's advantage?
Yeah, so this really changes quite substantially over the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. So at first, There are lots of newspapers, but it takes until even the 1890s when scholars start to say, hang on a moment, we should know how many newspapers there are and how many people are reading them and whether this intersects with voting patterns at all. So it begins really with just things like press clippings. So you'll see if you go into archives, and this is true in Germany, but also in other countries, just collections of press clippings about certain themes. And that gets taken as a kind of proxy for public opinion. So we've seen what the conservative newspaper says and what the liberal newspaper says and the more Marxist newspaper. And that's taken to just represent public opinion. So that means that government elites try to intervene in what newspapers are publishing, thinking that will then influence public opinion. And what we see then after World War I, particularly, is the growth of much more interest in more rigorous studies of public opinion, partly because journalists get uncomfortable with the fact that they've been so involved with propaganda during World War I. They and the newly emergent journalism studies or newspaper studies start to reflect on what's the actual relationship between these two things? Can we measure it more statistically? Can we do surveys to try to understand what people actually think once they've read the newspaper? And that by the sort of mid-20th century starts to emerge into public opinion surveys, things like Gallup, the sorts of techniques that we're much more used to today.
What change was there after the initial sort of era we're talking about in the early 20th century that maybe didn't serve as a reset, but that was sort of the next major shift in how public opinion and published opinion need to be considered and evaluated separately? Was it a technological change that took place and shifted us into the next phase? Or was it something else in terms of the relationships between some of these wire services and governments, or, something else altogether?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important, you're right, is developments of new technology. And one of the things I talk about in this book is that we often mistakenly see technology as something that's sort of autonomous, but actually you can see with the Germans that they become really interested in information, particularly around 1900, and they start to see it as a way to exert global power. I mean, it's a bit like they see information not as soft power, but as a way of achieving hard power. And one of the things they do at the same time, the German government, for example, is to invest in a new technology that's known as wireless telegraphy. So it's basically sending telegrams through the air using electrical signals. And the German government subsidizes private companies to do research and development into this new technology, really driven by this political vision that you should be able to spread news around the world and bypass telegraphy and submarine cables that many Germans fear are controlled by the British. So you can see as this technology develops over the first few decades of the 20th century and accelerated by what happens during World War I, that this technology becomes something that we call a one-to-many technology. So that means you have one wireless tower and then it's sending to many, many wireless devices. And that wasn't how it was originally conceived as a technology. It was conceived like telegraphy, which was one cable here, ending cable there. And so what you can show is, okay, this technology is developing because of political and economic visions of what news should be, and eventually that will morph into spoken radio as well.
Can you talk a little bit about how the increased restriction within Germany in exactly the ways that you talk about in sort of the post-World War I era actually allowed or maybe even eased the way in which the Nazi regime was able to take over the communications within the country?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much terrible irony to a lot of the history that I talk about, because obviously after World War I, Germany becomes a democracy, but it's a pretty febrile one. There are lots of political uprisings, both on the far left and on the far right. And this is also the moment when spoken radio emerges in the early 1920s. And one bureaucrat, Hans Bredow, is charged with figuring out how should we regulate this industry. And he thinks radio is a great opportunity. It's a way that we can bring together this population. We can give people who are tired entertainment, classical music. We can uplift them through educational programs. But we need to have some state supervision of what's going on here, because we don't want to have too much news, because news might inspire more political uprisings. And as the Weimar Republic goes on, political unrest continues. There will be multiple radio reforms pushed by people like Bredow, who say, okay, we actually need more state supervision over this content because it's a way to actually preserve democracy, because we can stop news from sowing further divisions in the population. So there are a couple of radio reforms, and what that means is there's essentially state supervision of content by the time the Nazis come to power. So that ironically, these measures that were meant to save democracy, they mean that when the Nazis come to power, immediately they have control of radio content. So there's this moment in August of 1933, about 7 months after the Nazis come to power, where Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, says, the Nazis couldn't have come to power and held it like they did without the airplane and the radio. And the airplane was something that made Hitler seem very modern because he flies around and gives lots of speeches, so that helps him come to power. But it's the radio that helps the Nazis really secure their position and establish an authoritarian dictatorship.
It seems that there's this interesting analogy between the use of communications technology for propagandizing and the possibility that any technology can also be intercepted or manipulated. So like from the IT side, there's always this idea that every time there's a new technology, with it come new ways of possibly interfering, hacking, whatever the case may be, even back to like using drums in Africa to communicate from one village to another, whether or not some rival village was coming, those drum signals could also be intercepted and manipulated. In the sort of same way, it seems that with every new communication technology came ways in which it could and was used for propaganda purposes in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that we can see, even building on top of that, is that there are quite similar rhetorics around new technologies, which even brings us up to the internet today. So you can see with radio, for example, initially there's sort of utopian rhetoric. It's going to be the savior of the nation. That's true in Germany, in Britain, in the US as well. It's going to bring people together. It's going to make a community out of these fractured societies where industrialization has sort of pulled people apart. So initially it's really utopian rhetoric about what radio can do. And then in the 1930s, when Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany are using radio to try and broadcast fascist propaganda within their countries and also outside of it, now radio seems to be a tool of demagogues and dictators. So we see this sort of move from utopian hopes into dystopian nightmares, and then often settling somewhere in between, a recognition that this technology is neither our savior nor is it our devil. It's what we as humans make of it that matters most.
Is there or are there ways in which the sort of role and positioning of Fox News in the United States today have parallels or analogs to what you talk about in the book from the early 20th century?
So there is some analog, I think. So there's one right-wing media magnate, a man called Alfred Hugenberg, who creates a whole vertically integrated media empire. So he has everything from the paper companies that are manufacturing the paper for his newspapers, advertising agencies, his own news agency, and then he also ends up buying the biggest film company in Weimar, Germany, which was a very big film industry at that point, the one that made films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, for example. And Hugenberg's company does bear some resemblances to Fox in the sense that he basically asks his editors to push what he calls a sort of nationalist point of view, something that's more autarkic. He has a particular political party that he supports, but he doesn't want the editors to necessarily just support that party, but just have a particular point of view. And ironically, what ends up happening is the amount of support for his right-wing party drops, but much more support is created for Hitler. So he's sort of outmaneuvered in many ways because people don't vote as his newspapers tell them to. They actually vote further to the right. And I think there are some parallels to the way that Fox supported certain candidates in the primaries for the 2016 election. Then it ends up being Donald Trump who actually gets the vote, who's not necessarily the candidate putting forward the views that Fox News would have represented at that point, but then Fox also makes its accommodations with Trump.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've been reminding my audience that early in the 2016 primary, Fox was actually not behind Donald Trump. Yeah. And in fact, there were some pretty high profile conflicts between Trump and Fox News. At a certain point, and I don't know if it's when Fox realized that Trump had the momentum or what exactly pushed it over the edge, Fox did become very pro-Trump and sort of got to where it was over the last couple of years. But I also believe that if the continued polling trouble is very visible for Donald Trump, and it seems as though he might lose in 2020, I don't think Fox News will necessarily stick with him. I mean, they are decidedly right-wing, and their funders impose that they must continue to push a right-wing agenda. But I don't actually think that it's about Donald Trump specifically, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that change.
Right, and it's also about bottom lines. I mean, it is a commercial
profit
television, right? It's for profit. And if your advertisers are withdrawing their support, and I think that actually brings us right back to the beginning of our conversation about published versus public opinion. So opinion polls are taken as the main sort of proxy for public opinion. And if those fall below a certain point, and if Fox sees its viewership drop and the number of advertisers drop, that could certainly lead to different perspectives being shown on Fox. Now, moving away from being right-wing, I doubt it, but changing some of those perspectives, I think it's not impossible. And you're quite right to remind people of that 2016 moment where Fox makes certain decisions and doesn't necessarily support Trump wholeheartedly at all. When you look back at the earlier broadcast, they were pushing other candidates like Ted Cruz.
A lot of what we've been discussing today is from the book News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945. We've, of course, been speaking with the book's author, Dr. Heidi Tworek, who's an assistant professor of international history at the University of British Columbia. Heidi, so great to talk to you today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Mitch McConnell has been the obstructor-in-chief, sort of the real hatchet man for Republicans, and he's been doing a brilliant job of just getting in the way of stuff. We've talked about, over the last couple of years, he prevented Merrick Garland from having Supreme Court confirmation hearings under Barack Obama, so Donald Trump got himself an extra Supreme Court pick thanks to Mitch McConnell. He has been preventing election security bills from being debated while he takes money from lobbyists for the two biggest voting machine companies in the United States. And he was on Fox News. And instead of addressing any of those obstructive acts, which he should address, and I would love to hear him pressed about, he said, if Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. become states, that would be part of the socialist agenda of the democratically controlled House of Representatives. Statehood for D.C. and Puerto Rico would be in some way socialistic, according to Mitch McConnell. Take a listen to this.
For the first time in my memory, I agree with Nancy Pelosi. I am indeed the Grim Reaper when it comes to the socialist agenda that they've been ginning up over in the House with overwhelming Democratic support and sending it over to America, things that would turn us into a country we've never been. They're on the way to doing some additional things, in addition to the ones they've already done, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. And by the way, you may have mentioned this on your show, but they plan to make the District of Columbia state. That'd give them 2 new Democratic senators. Puerto Rico state would give them 2 more new Democratic senators. And as a former Supreme Court clerk yourself, you've surely noticed that they plan to expand the Supreme Court. So this is full bore socialism on the march in the House. And yeah, as long as I'm the majority leader of the Senate, none of that stuff is going anywhere.
None of that stuff, he says, is going anywhere. Now, understand the complete and total misdirection that is going on here. Mitch McConnell is sort of good at this, but of course, he's helped along by Fox News letting him do it. Mitch McConnell obstructed bills meant to release an unredacted version of the Mueller report, multiple bills, in fact. He wouldn't give him the time of day, just dead on arrival to the Senate. Mitch McConnell continues to obstruct every election security bill meant to protect the 2020 election and future elections from future interference. He's doing that now, and his campaign is getting money from lobbyists for the 2 biggest voting machine manufacturers in the United States. And yet he goes on Fox News and says, I control the discussion in the Senate, and no, none of this socialist stuff is going anywhere under my watch. What about election security that you keep obstructing? And then, of course, we have to at least briefly address that D.C. and Puerto Rico becoming states isn't socialist. Socialism, of course, defined as a range of economic and social systems characterized by social ownership of the means of production and workers' self-management, as well as the political theories and movements associated with them. And as you can see by looking at the definition of socialism, that territories and federal districts becoming states is not socialism. I'm not a socialist, but when the right starts calling things socialism, my ears perk up because there's a very good chance that those are pretty damn good ideas if they are being assailed as socialism by uninformed Republicans. Steve King, you might remember, horrible, racist, xenophobic Republican congressman, once said that gay marriage is socialism. Two men being able to get married is like the workers controlling the means of production. What? What are you talking about? Gay marriage is social ownership of the means of production? This is their move. If they want to oppose something, they call it socialist, even if it's not. And in fact, DC and Puerto Rico having a say in government matters that affect them is not socialism. It's representative democracy, which I thought was the system that we had. And it's really important to note that not all Republicans are even united on this DC statehood thing. There are Republicans that are supportive of DC statehood. There are probably more Republicans that are supportive of Puerto Rican statehood rather than DC statehood. But this is the postmodernism that they claim to oppose. They accuse us of having no fixed meanings for language and concepts and words. Everything is malleable. Nothing has any meaning. It can all be whatever we want it to be. And then they say, oh, statehood for territories and federal districts, that's socialism, which implies words have no meaning. Nothing means anything. Anything can be socialism if Republicans determine that it's bad. This guy must be removed. As important, I would say, as the removal of Donald Trump from the White House. When you think about just the next several decades and the impact on the justice system and the courts and so much else, we've got to remove Mitch McConnell. If it's not as important as removing Trump, it's very, very close. Rick Wiles is a Christian-based conspiracy theorist and a racist and an all-around horrible person for the things that he has said and done over the last several decades. We've talked about him before, but not in a while. And he now has a program on something called True News, TRU News, which he created. He used to work for the Christian Broadcasting Network. He eventually went over to Trinity Broadcasting Network. These are all extremist far-right Christian media organizations. And as you can probably guess just from what I've told you so far, Rick Wiles is anti-gay, Rick Wiles is anti-immigrant, Rick Wiles is anti-Semitic. He's checking off all of the normal boxes that we would expect him to check, but he's now going after faux meat burgers. I guess veggie burgers, black bean burgers, mushroom burgers, lab-grown meat, Impossible burgers. That's a new vegan burger that is around, which I've tried before. I guess all of these are part of the problem that is designed to steal people's souls by preventing them from being able to be born again. Take a look at how he said it. Don't take my word for it.
When you go to your favorite fast food restaurant, you're going to be eating a fake hamburger. You're going to go to the grocery store and buy a pound of fake hamburger or a fake steak, and you won't know that it was grown in some big corporation's laboratory. This is the nightmare world that they're taking us into. They're changing God's creation. Why? They want to change human DNA so that you can't be born again. That's where they're going with this, to change the DNA of humans so it will be impossible for a human to be born again. They want to create a race of soulless creatures on this planet.
I know I've said this before, but if fake burgers are so terrible, and if his God is so powerful, why didn't his God just prevent the creation of vegan burgers, right? Like, if this is such an evil that needs to be rooted out, why would his all-powerful and all-knowing God allow the creation of vegan burgers? And this entire critique about vegan burgers destroying people's souls and all of it, this is the wrong critique of vegan burgers. The right critique of some of these burgers is that they're mostly not very good. I've had some pretty good non-meat burgers, like at some restaurants that make them in-house, but every pre-packaged veggie burger I've tried has been mediocre. Even that Impossible burger that people are up in arms about, saying it's so great, recently tried it. It looks like and has the consistency of raw meat even after you've grilled it. It's just not that good. That's the tragedy. Not that it's going to destroy your soul as a massive plot to prevent you from becoming born again. And by the way, if you want to destroy people's souls to prevent them from becoming born again Christians, through getting them to eat veggie burgers, you're failing, because most people I know don't like veggie burgers. The veggie burgers are going to have to get way better if you want more than a tiny fraction of the population to start regularly eating them in order to self-destroy their own souls. But seriously, does this guy believe what he's saying, or is it all shtick? Maybe to sell stuff, or I don't even know if he sells stuff, maybe just to make money and get donations. I went to the True News website. It's completely whacked out with conspiracy theories, but you can donate. They will accept shares of stock. You can donate cryptocurrency. You can leave money to them in your will. Can you imagine? They will also accept precious metals from you. It's really a scene that they're going there. And then, by the way, and this is where it all comes full circle, where you can take action. You can submit prayer requests. No matter how big or small the request, they say, you can submit prayer requests on their website. Please go to truenews.com/prayer. That's trunews.com/prayer. Submit prayer requests that are related to the David Pakman Show. They can be inside jokes. Anything goes. If any of these get aired or answered by Rick Wiles, we will absolutely play them on the show. If we hear about it, which you might have to tell us, since I certainly don't watch this garbage, but truenews.com/prayer. Let's see if we can get some progressive or David Pakman Show inside jokes mentioned there. I have such a funny voicemail to play today. As many of you know, we don't swear on the David Pakman Show. Like, sometimes there will be swears on my YouTube live streams because those are only on YouTube and swearing is okay. But because the show is on nearly 200 radio and television stations, and a lot of these, most of them, are bound by FCC regulations, we keep the show FCC safe because we don't want to get our affiliate stations fined in any way. I got a call from a very sweet-sounding mom of a young David Pakman Show viewer, or presumed David Pakman Show viewer, who says that her kid is picking up a lot of swearing from me. And of course, I don't swear on the show. I think that this mom has me mixed up with Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk, who swears like a sailor. Take a listen to this.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Pakman. I am the mother of one of your subscribers. He is a huge fan of yours, but unfortunately, he's imitating you a lot and swearing a lot, which is just unbecoming for a young man. I just wanted to ask you politely if you might be able to just be aware that you have some young listeners, right, and not swear as much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Yeah.
We don't swear on the show. Can't be me. So I would check again with your son whether he's picking up the swearing from me or from Kyle Kulinski or from somebody else. But I think there is a case of mistaken identity here. It is definitely not me that is doing the swearing. Although he sounds like a great kid if he's watching progressive independent media. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about the latest allegations against Alex Jones. They involve child porn, insanely enough. We will talk about the evolution of the eyes of dogs to appeal to humans and our emotions. And we will also talk about a Confederate monument in Nashville that has been vandalized with the words, "they were racist." It's anti-racist vandalism against a Confederate monument. Or, as maybe someone like Alex Jones might suggest, is it a false flag meant to make the anti-racists look bad? All of those stories and more on today's bonus show, www.joinpakman.com, to become a member and get instant access to the award-winning awards we've created and given ourselves, award-winning bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.